The reason that I don't have an independent lecture on this subject is simply that we don't have a great debate. And I told the organizers that it's better that Israel, Professor Finkelstein, will represent this subject, and I'll just have a few comments, because basically we agree on the principles. But there are some, I would say, several points of difference which I would like to emphasize. It is correct that, of course, these stories were written late, and they reflect in many aspects the time of writing, the time of the authors. But in my view, and in many others, I must say, in these stories, we can find many ancient memories which have some historical validity. And here, of course, there are various scholars and various views. For example, there were several books published recently, in last years, on the Exodus, for example, who portrayed the Exodus as a historical event. A scholar from Trinity College up here near Chicago, James Hofmeyr, who is an excellent Egyptologist and excavates in Egypt, published recently a book on the Exodus where he describes this as a real event on the background of the 13th century BC events related to the 13th century, to the time of Ramesses II. An important German archaeologist, Edgar Pusch, is now digging, this year, is digging the capital of Ramesses II. Ramesses II was a famous pharaoh who ruled 67 years in the 13th century BC. Many scholars believed that he is the pharaoh of the Exodus. During his time, we have to look for the time of Moses and so on. Now, he built a huge city. This city is called Ramses. In the book of Exodus, we hear that the children of Israel built the city of Ramses. We read it every year in the Pesach, in the Haggadah. And it's built of clay, of tin, of clay. And this city is being excavated by Edgar Pusch. It's a huge city of about 300 hectares, tremendous. And Edgar Pusch clearly states that he thinks that this city is related to the city mentioned in the biblical traditions relating to Israel. This does not mean that the story of Moses and the Exodus is an historical truth. But we have enough data in Egypt from this period to tell us that there was a vast West Semitic population. When we say West Semitic, we speak about populations that spoke Canaanite, but Canaanite and Hebrew, you know, they are cousins, they are very much related languages. That means there was a lot of West Semites families living there in Egypt. In the Middle Bronze Age, 300 years earlier, they even ruled, they had their own dynasty, the 15th dynasty, so-called Hyksos. But many of them continued to live in this area, and we know that a lot of West Semitic words were introduced into Egyptian and so on and so forth. We have papyri describing such slaves of West Semitic origin escaping into the Sinai Desert. There are not 600,000 people, as mentioned in the book of Exodus. There are very few. But typologically, it gives us the idea of the Exodus. That means slaves of West Semitic origin escape to the Sinai. When Moses takes the children of Israel out into the Sinai, he says, we should go through the desert. We shall bypass the road, Derech Eretz Plishtim, it says in the Bible, the road of the land of the Philistines. Now, we know that the road from Egypt to the Sinai, to the Gaza Strip of today, Gaza was a main Egyptian stronghold in those days, in the 13th century, was well fortified. All along the northern Sinai, the Egyptians built a very strong, well fortified road. So this is the road of the land of the Philistines. Of course, the Bible knows this road as a road leading to Philistia. But this road was well fortified. It was strong to pass, difficult to pass, and thus the story tells us that they go around. So we can see in this story of the Exodus some ideas, some motifs, which may be rooted in the second millennium BC. That's all I say. I don't say that the Exodus was a real event. It might be an event that is related to a small group of people. We shall return it in my lecture later this morning. Many scholars, or quite a number of scholars, believe that the Israelites were related to the Shasu. The Shasu, we shall return to this later on. I'll escape this one here. Here you can see some of the Canaanites in Egypt. We are talking about this area. Here is the city of Ramesses in the northwestern part of the Delta region. And this is part of a map, the oldest map that we have in the world, by a pharaoh called Seti I, around 1300 BC, on the wall of the temple of Amun at Karnak, where it describes this is the Pelusiac branch of the Nile and the fortresses along the road leading to the land of Israel. And this is, of course, the road up here and so on. In the Bible, in the Exodus story, the Midianites play a very important role. We don't know much about the Midianites, but we have a very distinct material culture that was found here in this region, northwest Arabia, southwest of Aqaba and Eilat, southeast of Aqaba and Eilat here, with very nice painted pottery, as you can see here, which was identified by several scholars as Midianite. This identification, ethnic identification, is not secure, but it's the only evidence that we have from this particular period, from the 13th century, 12th century BC, relating to people who lived in this area, which we may be related to those Midianites. Of course, we cannot reconstruct the road of the exact route of the Exodus, and you can see in this map at least 3 different routes. And there are scholars, we have about 7 identifications of Mount Sinai everywhere in the Sinai and the southern Negev. So a lot of scholars made their living from identifying Mount Sinai and the road along the Sinai, but I don't think that we can really say a thing. In the Byzantine period, for example, it was identified here in Jebel Musa, the imposing site here. Kadesh Barnea, Professor Finkelstein spoke about it, is well known to us. It was so important in the Exodus tradition, but we have no evidence from the 13th century or this time of the Exodus from there. Why should we? They were nomadic peoples. They were just wandering, so they didn't leave any evidence behind. But more important, which I really want to emphasize, are a few details related to the Conquest story. And excuse me that I do it orally. I don't read now any lecture, but I just want to mention a few or 3 examples related to the Conquest story. The Conquest story is really very much disappointing to those who look for real history in the Bible. And you can read in this book that I wrote, Archaeology of the Land of the Bible, 15 years ago I already summarized this subject and I didn't change my mind. It's all the same. In most cases, we indeed don't have evidence. We don't have, the evidence is negative. Site by site, we start with Arad, which is not even mentioned in the book of Joshua. It's mentioned in the book of Numbers, or Heshbon in Transjordan, or Jericho, or Ai, all these places that were destroyed by Joshua. We don't have a Canaanite city there to be destroyed. Or if there was a Canaanite city, as you heard, it was destroyed either in the early 13th century or in the mid-12th century. There are big differences in dates and so on and so forth. So we don't accept now, most of us, the Exodus story as a true historical story. On the other hand, I think that in this story we have embedded some historical recollections, old memories, which perhaps passed orally through centuries until they found their place in the narrative that we have in the Bible. And some of these memories might be even pre-Israelite. That means they could be Canaanite memories, which passed through indigenous, the local population, from generation to generation until they found their way, and we find them as we find them in the text. One example is Chatzor. Professor Finkelstein mentioned it. Chatzor, sorry. Here you can see the site of Hatzor. Hatzor is the largest city in Canaan. But when was it the largest city in Canaan? It was the largest city in Canaan in the second millennium, between 1800 and 1250 BC. It was 80 hectares, a huge city. And it was destroyed by heavy conflagration fire that burnt the major buildings. Here is a reconstruction of the palace of Hatzor that was recently excavated by my colleague, Professor Amnon Ben-Tor, on the upper part of Hatzor. It is a tremendous building, one of the largest buildings ever excavated in this country, totally destroyed by heavy fire. The date of the destruction is cannot be clearly established. The most current research points to a date somewhere in the middle of the 13th century BC. That means during the time of Ramesses II, probably. But the fact is that we don't have any clear evidence who destroyed it. The book of Joshua says that Joshua burned Hatzor. By the way, it's the only city that is mentioned in the book of Joshua that Joshua really burned it, put it in fire. And the book of Joshua says that Hatzor was once the head of all these kingdoms. That means the author knows that Hatzor was the megalopolis. It was New York of those days. It was the largest city in Canaan, one of the largest in the Middle East. So here we have an historical memory of a huge, tremendous destruction. Who destroyed it? The excavators of Hatzor, Professor Yadin, and recently Professor Ben-Tor, both believed that they were the Israelites. Yadin was a great believer in Joshua. He was sure that Joshua really passed from one city to the other and destroyed all of them, until the end of his life, 1983, his last paper. Ben-Tor is also supporting this idea. He thinks that they were the Israelites. He says, who could destroy it? Another Canaanite city? Probably not. Who could destroy it? And he comes to the conclusion that probably they were the Israelites. In my view, we cannot say. We don't know what is the reason for the destruction of Hatzor. It was a total collapse of a huge city. It was one of the greatest blows that Canaan suffered in the 13th century. But what I claim is that this destruction, this heavy collapse of this huge city was so traumatic to the local population of Palestine, of Canaan, in the late Bronze Age, in the second millennium BC, that the memory was known, was recollected for centuries and centuries, and later it was adopted by the Israelites and entered this saga, this story of the conquest of entire Canaan. And we have other cases. The case of Hai that was mentioned before, this is the site of Hai, is also quite interesting. Because here we have a case where we have a huge city here, fortified city. How do we know that this is Hai? That's another problem, but let us assume that this identification is correct. The identification is based on the fact that the Bible tells us where Hai was. The biblical author knew that his readers don't know where is Hai. So he describes where is Hai. It says east of Bet El. Bet El was known. They knew where is Bet El. So this is east of Bet El. If we go east of Bet El, we have a desert. And between Bet El, Beitin, the site of Beitin, it's well known, to the desert, between those two, there is only one large archaeological site known. This area was surveyed thoroughly, and we have only one site. This is this site which you see here, which was excavated by one of the first Jewish archaeologists, Judith Krause-Marke. If you know history of Zionism, the director of Mikveh Israel, of this agricultural school, this is his daughter, and she excavated here in 1936, and later American expedition. Both of them found a huge early Bronze Age fortified city. And this fortified city was destroyed when? 2300 BC. It stood in ruins, and these ruins can be seen. If you go to this site, you will see the ruins. They are standing, huge walls, city walls, palaces. You can see them. On top of these ruins, during the Iron Age there was a settlement, a small, tiny village, one of the villages that we shall discuss in the next lecture, that we relate to the Israelite settlement in the 12th and 11th centuries BC. Now, those settlers who lived here in this little settlement, they knew that they are sitting on top of a ruined city. There was a huge ruined city, heavy walls, city gates destroyed. And here we have a case of etiology. What is etiology? They saw the remains of a ruined city and they invented a story. a story of conquest of this city. They were not archaeologists. They didn't know that it was destroyed 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years before they arrived. But they invented a story of conquest based on the local topography. If you read the story in the book of Joshua of the conquest of Ai, the topography fits very well the site, the valleys, the roads all around. They fit the site very well because the story was invented probably by local people who lived there. Now, this village was abandoned. It did not continue to develop into an Iron Age city, town, during the time of the monarchy. This is a case, a very important case, where we may think that the etiology was created during the period of the judges, during the time of settlement, during the 12th and 11th centuries. It's not an etiology of the 7th century. It's an etiology of the 11th century, which found its way into the biblical text. So this is, I think, how we should work, relating archaeology with the text, with the stories as we find them in the Bible, trying to find, as we say, the Sitzenleben, the background, the real background to the creation of these stories. Well, I think that this comment will be enough, and we shall return to some of these subjects in the following lecture.